It's that time of year, allergy season in Kentucky, and it's hit my voice today. So I don't know how much talking I'm going to be doing in this meeting. I may just be doing more listening and pointing at people to talk instead of me. But I hope everybody had a good long Labor Day weekend, the weekend before, and enjoyed your off week last week, and then getting ready to dig into things this afternoon. We do have a new person joining us today that's joined on with the AIC committee for consultation, and that's Laura Pinsonneau. So I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit about herself.
Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Laura Pinsonneau. I am a colleague of Andre's at the Center for Assessment. And prior to my time at the center, it hasn't even coming up on 2 years. I was the accountability director for the state of Wisconsin for about a decade and had worked previously at that department doing a lot of data reporting and data literacy work. So I like to think about how we support schools getting better and how we use information to help them with that. And I'm really pleased to be able to be a part of the conversations with all of you.
We're glad to have you, Laura. Kathy's going to update us from other committees today as well.
Kathy, you're on mute.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Real quick, I'll just give you a few updates on where we are. Since we are the first committee that usually meets each month, there are not that many updates to share. However, this month, BNF Bold New Futures did meet before us on September 5th, so I'll share some updates from them first. The BNF committee modified their Portrait of a Learner survey and ask all committees to either conduct interviews or send out the survey for more responses. Now, this is a short survey, and I encourage you to complete it if you have time. It's not very long, and you can even pass it on. I just clicked on the link and passed it on to some of the parents and community members and teachers and businesses and school district people that I knew so that they could have an opportunity to give us some feedback. The deadline is September 18th. And as of last week, they had received 42 new responses. So that's really a great response for considering how many they got the last time. Bold New Futures also has formed a policy work group that they met for the first time about 2 weeks ago. And they're taking on a couple of recommendations at each meeting as they focus on developing detailed policy plans. The first two focuses have been on funding planning grants to districts that are part of L3. And then secondly, they want to compare and contrast our Portrait of a Learner with the Council on Post-Secondary Education's graduate profile. So the policy work groups will recommend to the full committee as they work, to their full committee as they work on it, and then they will bring it to us if they think that it's, well, they pretty much are sure that they'll be bringing it to us. They're also discussing whether or not to develop a policy agenda to bring to the full council in November, and they noted that their work will also influence our committee's recommendations for accountability and assessment. Then Vibrant Learners, they're creating a platform that indicates what it means to be a vibrant learner. They're looking at creating a set of indicators for the platforms and are looking at how Canopy might fit into the platform development. And you'll recall Andre introduced us to Canopy when we were looking at our prototypes. I'd like to remind everyone that the council letter also gives updates on each committee. And if you want to see the committee meetings, you can go to the KDE Media portal and you'll be able to observe their meetings as well. And did I forget anything, Susan, Andre, or Jennifer, that I might need to share about the committees?
Nothing that comes to my mind.
I think it was a good overview.
Right.
Thank you, Kathy.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you, Kathy, for sharing that with us. We're going to move on into discussing our moonshot, as Karen's email to the committee had asked us to consider that because we're going to be looking at drafting a moonshot for the entire council at the November convening. And so part of the pre-work for this meeting today was to rewatch Lou Young's discussion about the moonshot from the November convening meeting last fall. And so in that, she discussed about how, you know, the moonshot is that lofty goal or that monumental feat, a new project that could have outstanding results after one intense effort. And it's that vision to ideation to implementation and a strategic approach to tackle a huge problem and proposing a radical solution, not just small incremental improvements and not focusing on failure, just success and improving learner outcomes for all. So we want to acknowledge our milestones from the past year. So as we're heading into this portion of the meeting, we want to be thinking about what have we already accomplished and where do we want to go as we're starting to vision our moonshot for the whole council and how from the lens of our committee. So initial thoughts on this, and I'm probably going to be the note taker because that's about all I've got on voice right now.
You know, Sarah, something that might be helpful to aid in our brainstorming here is Karen Dodd had put together just sort of a straw person moonshot for us to look at, and maybe we use that and work from that in terms of what resonates, what doesn't, what ideas might be missing.
And I can do that. Well, I've got that to pull up. Give me just a minute. There we go.
And we also want to encourage you, if there's any thoughts that you'd like to drop in the chat as well. We'll be checking the chat to see if there's anything that you want to drop in there as the conversation goes on. Because sometimes I know we'll start thinking about things and it might be easier for you to just make sure that your thoughts are shared if you just drop it into our chat.
I'm not sure how I managed to do that, but I went forward a screen.
Yeah.
There we go. Can you all see that? The moonshot draft that Karen Dodd sent to us. Yeah. The protocol, perfect. Okay, so taking a look at this, kind of the general idea, as Susan was saying, sometimes it's easier to look at what we think fits or what doesn't fit in our thinking rather than trying to draft something from scratch. So looking at this statement, what in particular resonates with you? Is this faithful to our design principles?
Maybe, Sarah, in a variation on that question might be, what does it mean to put this kind of general statement into practice from your local experiences or situations? So for example, I'm going to pick on you, Azadeh, since I know you're on the call, right? Like, what does it mean for the context that you work in to feel really like they're being transformed, being more humane, and serve the students better through a culture of shared commitments to continuous improvement? Like, what does that really mean to you? And or it doesn't have to be your personal context, but it could also be context that you're working in. And this goes to everybody who's on the call. So I wanted to offer that up.
Suzanne, I see your note in the chat that talks about something where the student is more centered. We don't see the word student here. Somebody pointed that out to us in our planning meeting, and I think that idea resonates, and the idea of equity as well.
Yeah, I think that's where I was at, was immediately we don't actually talk about students at all. We don't talk about communities. You could argue as their families, but communities is also the broader districts, and the fact that we have folks trying to connect with industries, and the portrait of a learner is more about how do we get them job ready. It concerns me, being in a group of educators, that we don't have the created transformed at student-centered educational system. I think that would be a piece where you could easily insert not only student-centered, but upfront from the get-go. And one of the things, we're doing since the last meeting is we're instituting PBIS even in our detention centers. And before you look at the history of juvenile justice, and it's all punishment based, we're allowing our teachers and educators to now take the lead on how we're going to run rewards and consequences. And that's a huge shift for us. So if we can put our students up front and be more student focused, I would hope that a room of 100 educators could also do the same.
Thank you, Azurdi. I really appreciate a lot of what you had to say there. And I jotted down your notes about implementing PBIS because I think that's pretty awesome that you all are able to do that in a DJJ school. I'm trying to monitor the chat and listen to people at the same time. Suzanne, do you want to elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by you would like to see something about learning more than just practices?
Yeah, I think for me, a couple of things that stood out obviously was like the absence of student, but when you place the emphasis on student, you're thinking about what then happens. What do we want to happen for the student? This is really not about instructional practices as much as what we want the outcomes to be for students. And I think Azurdi talked a little bit more about like being career ready or, changing their futures. Like we want them to reach their fullest potential or whatever. I don't really know how we want to word that, but that if we shift the perspective on what we're doing as teachers and what we want, I guess I'm not saying to rule out what we want as a community, but then it should result in things from students, not just changing how we do things. Obviously that to me is like implied that we would have to change how we do things in order to get what we really want for all students. Does that help?
Sorry, yes, that helps a lot. I'm just trying to keep up with you on notes so I can type this up into something coherent later. Because I've heard multiple people talk about the student being missing from this. As we're thinking about it, if we're thinking about is this faithful to our design principles? So looking at, and I can pull those up as well. Susan, do you mind dropping in the chat the design principles one pager? Because I'm wondering if this is the that I had pulled up. Honestly, sorry.
Yeah, it's in the chat, Sarah. Yep.
Is it perfect? Okay, yeah, let's pull that up. There we go. And then I'll share screen from the So looking at our design principles then. And I noticed right off the bat that we've got students there as design principle number 2, that we're thinking particularly about our marginalized students at the center, that several of y'all mentioned, and the part about empowering students as agents of their own learning. So those are things that we've noted are missing in this draft moonshot. Is there anything else in the lens of that you feel like is something that we need to add or that we need to change? I mean, and this is again just a draft. Like this is not anything that we have to go with. We can completely write our own. If you think of a really good one and you want to email it to me or drop it in the chat, feel free.
Sarah, if I could interject, we really struggled with whether or not to even put something in there. We truly wanted something that people could just throw darts at. That was, no one said this is what we think it should be. So definitely were looking for that input. Like I said, we struggled because we didn't want it to look like it's coming from us. We just wanted a place to start. And the other thing I'm wondering, as I look at your principles here, what would be a higher level of all of that? So I guess I'm kind of thinking of a moonshot or as more of like a vision statement, something, pretty short. I know some of the feedback that we got in the survey was I wouldn't know how to tell somebody what we do in an elevator.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of what we're looking for when it comes to a moonshot, whereas maybe these principles are going to be more specific once we get into the actual design of it. Would you all agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
I would. Yeah, I think it's all about translation, right? Of like different kinds of ideas. So like you said, the moonshot is a very broad, high level summary that should give people an orientation of where people are going. Design principles also, like you said, are about designing something, right? So that you sort of say these are the features that our solution could have. But then in order to figure out what they mean, you have to actually apply it to something and do some of the work. So that is then, and that gets you then to things like, either the architecture we're going to talk about later, which is what is the architecture of the systems that we might be thinking about, what are sort of some tools and processes like the database or systems bank or educational portals that could be redesigned, and the practices around that. And really through that process, I think you have really a chance to reflect on everything, right? And it's a little bit in this iterative cycle where I think the more people will be doing work like that, as they already are doing, the more we might refine the collection of design principles here. And I might also say that if you look at these, I mean, when we wrote those, it was based on the work that was done and the conversation that were being had about the work within and outside of Kentucky. And they really are in clusters, right? So like 1 through 3 to 4, 1 to 3 are mostly the aspirational humanistic goals. Then like 4 through 6 are more about almost like technical orientational goals about what some of the aspects of that system are. And then, 7 to 12, that's all about almost more the some of it is almost more like the technocratic, how the work gets being done to do these systems kind of statements. So they're not also all the same. And so I think they could be possibly expanded. So one of the things that we've been talking about was that we really should do that across committees and really getting some sense as a co-counsel really on like what are some non-negotiables. So I think that work still needs to happen to some degree, and that's in part art.
So Azurdi is suggesting in the chat that we do forward-thinking, student-centered, sustainable learning for an equitable educational experience. The other question to think about is, as our work this year that we've done so far progressed us in that direction? Have we moved towards a unified vision or a big moonshot vision as a committee?
I might even take the pressure off, Sarah, just to make and almost say, what if we didn't phrase this in terms of our committee, but more like as the pool council, right? Because I think the committee can only do so much. And there's initiatives going on that are sort of like anchored in other committees where I think like they're doing a lot of this kind of work through like supporting the on the ground innovations around deeper learning and project-based learning, where we don't, in the first tier at least, we don't have like that much of a role to play. Otherwise, I think it creates a lot of tough expectation to say our committee has to do that by itself, So maybe that's a question to repeat that then. What about as a co-counsel, right? Like as a co-counsel, how well are we moving toward that goal, and then what can we as a committee do to support that further, maybe?
Or maybe even adding in, is the work that we're doing moving us towards that vision?
Yeah. That's in this one too.
Or do you feel like there's a big piece missing? Or maybe not a big piece, it could be a little one too.
Sarah, I've noticed that Cheryl's joined us. Cheryl, did you see the moonshot that we were working on? I don't know if it'd be helpful to toggle back to the moonshot description. We're talking about we're bringing forth brainstorming ideas about how we might refine our moonshot at the Cool Council meeting in November.
I'm going to post the link in the slide or the chat too, just so people can pull that. But then I'll share the screen back as well.
This could be revisited, right? If there's if people are struggling with that now, because I actually have a feeling it might be valuable after people are thinking through these architectures and maybe the system bank design to maybe let's come back to this at the end of the day and sort of say how is this thinking informing you to think about what this moonshot really means, because right now it's very broad directional language. So maybe this will help it unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, and I would even add to that the purpose is not for this committee to come up with the moonshot, really just to think about what you want to add to the conversation in November. So please don't feel like it's all on you all to come up with this.
The last thing that I would add in here is that Karen had shared with us the call to action that is in draft form still for the KDE in regards to the Cool Council. And so I've linked that down there in the chat, that last link in the chat. And that gives quite a bit to think about for vision and mission. And then it lists in there specifically the KDE goals, what is the Cool Council, and so on, just to give you some background pieces to kind of tie all that together as we're thinking about, and you're thinking about and ready to discuss and share in November about what we think the moonshot should be for the council, is the pieces that kind of surround that to pull all that together. And I'm checking the chat to see if anybody else would add. I appreciate what you said, Kathy, about where does data fit into this, about that we're going to have some data to support that. I certainly think that we've got quite a bit of research data to go into that just based on our work that we've done this year. And then Laura adding in about, how are we going to continue to use that data? Does anybody have anything else to add?
Just going to say, Sarah, that link that goes for me, when I click on the lowest in the chat, it goes to me to a folder with a lot of different documents.
Oh,
rather than directly.
Yeah, I'm looking for it because it actually has been finalized. I'll find it and share it.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Sorry, it was PDF, and I think it was just coming off my Google Drive.
Yeah.
Must have clicked the link for the drive itself and then.
And so maybe one thing to call out, since you just shared that, Sarah, is like in that document, and given that Karen, you are on the call and maybe can talk a little bit about one more time about what the context is from the board's perspective and KDE's perspective for this. There are some statements on one page that are about assessment, and then there's 2 more pages about accountability systems and structures. And just as a reminder, those came from like the 3 different working groups that were put together, and there was sort of constraints put onto this that these couldn't be too long, that it had to fit on a page. So it was, in my group at least, we went through this exercise of sort of taking the design principles that this committee had, listening to the board members, reconciling that, integrating, and sort of saying like, what are the kind of statements that seem to have the biggest weight or push, and that reflected still what was in the UWL report, United We Learn report, and in our work, and that's where that came from. But you know, a good question is, well, do we still agree with these? Is there something missing in that document, and how does that connect to the design principle? So it might be worth at least look at those and reflect on those. Let me see what I know. I can access this.
Jerry, what are you thinking there with the more humane educational practices? Like what resonates with you with that bit?
Well, I'm not sure. That's what I'm asking. I'm real curious as to the context around that, what we would consider more humane educational practices, or what is currently inhumane that we need to change. It's just an interesting statement. And I think that question might come up as the general public starts to look at a statement like that. What's that in reference to?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of people that would argue there's some inhumanity in making students test over and over and over again, and using up so much instructional time taking assessments. Now, a lot of that I feel like is a district decision because they're taking benchmark assessments to prepare them for the state assessment so they know how the kids are doing. But they're, you know, on how much instructional time are we spending taking assessments? And I'm not opposed to assessments. I'm just, you know, those are things that I've heard before.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to that conversation that we had both in our committee that came up in other committee meetings too, that you all being the people who are here from the community are not part of, which is this question about what are some non-negotiables, right? Essentially that we want. So the United We Learn report articulates some non-negotiables or some desires for the future sort of educational system, and I would call it in very humanistic, deeper value based kinds of ways. But we are assessment and accountability people, at least to a large degree, and so we have to think about that a lot. So the question is like, yeah, what are some non-negotiables, right, that our committee wants to advocate for? So Sarah, if you took what you just said, the non-negotiable may be, well, whatever the new system is, it needs to lead to a reduction in sort of undesired or unproductive mandated state assessment time, and it needs to replace that with maybe more performance-based defenses and exhibitions of learning oriented toward the portrait of a learner. So for example, you know, and then that, you know, does that mean more humane? I understand, Jerry, like that needs to be unpacked, and different people will probably mean different things by that, right? And it's a systemic argument, but at least I think there's this sort of question in our committee of like, how can we help across the committees come up with some of these sort of like non-negotiable design characteristics of what the system needs to have. That's currently a conversation that's being had.
And that would go into as well, and that's the last document I'm linking down here, is the I cannot talk today, the CGSA deliverables and milestones. So as we're thinking about crafting this vision, we want to make sure that we're in alignment with what we are promising to deliver with the grant that is funding this work. So people to concentrate when you're dressed like. So thinking about let me see. I thought everybody had access to that. Oh no, it's restricted. My apologies. That's the link. Karen, can you open the restrictions on that? Because that's the link for the CGSA document that you asked us to make sure everybody was familiar with. it's restricted to only people who've been added now. It's not a public document. The deliverables and milestones.
Yep.
Yeah.
I will do that.
Karen's going to open the settings. Sorry,
And
I didn't
I'm
realize
checking
it
with
was
Meredith for the approved call to action because I am not finding it. So
closed. Okay.
I'll get all of that.
So again, we're not going to draft anything today. This was just more of a opening discussion because this is going to be one of the pieces that we're continuing at the November convening as we work as a full council to draft a moonshot to provide vision and direction to our work over the course of the next year. But thank you all. Lots to discuss today. And you all brought up some great points. I appreciate everybody's considerations, and I've jotted down as many from the chat and from our conversation as I can, and I'll try to be getting those into a document together just to recap when we do some recap on minutes as well.
Sarah, was it the deliverables or the milestone document?
Yes, it was the milestones document.
Okay. It says it's open to everyone. Let me figure it out. I'll keep looking.
Okay.
Cheryl, was that a thumbs up that you were able to get in? All right, awesome.
Okay, it's now saying anyone with the link. So a minute ago it was saying restricted. So we're good now, Karen. Okay. Oh, and I like that, Suzanne, about instruction assessment practices are meaningful to all stakeholders.
And I've got a copy of the chat automatically saving, Sarah, so you don't need to copy down
Beautiful.
every word.
Beautiful. Okay, well, I think I've stumbled through that as much as my voice will allow me. And we're going to move on to looking at some of our system prototypes review with Susan next.
Great, thank you, Sarah. As we discussed last time, our committee facilitators group sort of spent some time over the past month looking through the system prototypes that each of the locally controlled, state supported, and state centralized group developed, and had some discussions about what might be some ideas for how to bring those prototypes together into what we might call the wonky term that we've all become accustomed to, a system of systems, right? So it's sort of just thinking about what is a state system that can value the good work that's happening on the ground in the local education systems across the state or across the Commonwealth. So how might a state assessment system or a state accountability system lift up and value some of that local work in a meaningful way, all in the effort to spread more vibrant learning experiences throughout the state? And there's a lot of different ways that this could turn out. Today, we're just going to point to two ideas that are on the table. And the reason that these two ideas are on the table is because we, as the committee facilitator group, feel that they represent at least some of the ideas that our committee put on the table in their prototypes and through the discussions over the past year and articulated in our design principles. And secondly, and really importantly here, we believe that there's sort of a viable technical and legal pathway to move these ideas forward. So what we're not presenting to you is something that is so out there that we don't see a way to make it legal under current federal or state law. Now, does that mean it doesn't push the bounds? No, we're going to still have lots of work for our policy committee and as a cool council, should the committee decide to move forward with one or both of these ideas. But really, we're putting them on the table so that hopefully we can generate some meaningful discussion and movement in this committee about how we might envision a future of assessment and accountability here in the state that upholds our design principles. So I'm going to share some slides now. I apologize, I'm working on a double screen, so I'll be looking over here because that's where my slides are, but I'm still talking to you here. So let me share my screen. Okay, so two possible design ideas. So just as a reminder quickly of where we have been up until this point, For our first few months together, our first 6 months together, we spent some time exploring innovative assessment and accountability systems, both within and beyond Kentucky. Based on that learning and discovery together, we then articulated some design principles, which we just refamiliarized ourselves with. Then over 2 months, since our last Cool Council meeting, we engaged in some systems design prototyping in small working groups. And now here we are in September discussing some possible ideas for the future of assessment and accountability in Kentucky. So each of the ideas takes a slightly different lens. The first idea here really focuses on the state assessment system. How might the state assessment system value the local work happening on the ground and help incentivize the spread of vibrant learning experiences? The second idea is more on school accountability and offers a possible design for how we might rethink school accountability to value those local systems that are happening in service to more vibrant learning experiences. So here's idea, the start of the slides for idea number 1, excuse me. So this is our current assessment system. Here in Kentucky, we assess our students a lot. We provide at least assessments in at least 5 subjects in grades 3 through 8, and then twice in high school. This is well above the minimum federal requirements for the amount of assessment that states must administer to their students. And so the first possible design idea we wanted to present to you was thinking about what would it look like here in Kentucky if at key milestone grade levels, for example, grade 5 and grade 8, instead of administering those 5 standardized assessments to students, we administered just 2 shorter form multiple choice standardized tests, and within the assessment system, valued local interdisciplinary defenses of learning. Well, what does that mean exactly? I think we would look to the districts that are already doing this on the ground, doing this well, and say, okay, what are the components of this system? What are the minimum technical requirements we would want to make sure that all districts would have in place? But the idea would be that the state of, or the Commonwealth of Kentucky recognizes that these are valuable learning experiences for students, valuable assessment experiences that yield information above and beyond what you can just gather from a state standardized assessment, and that the state wants to formally value that within the state assessment system. This would be one approach. This is something we could talk about. Are these the right grades? What does an interdisciplinary defensive learning look like, over the next 3 years? If we were to run with this idea, that's the kind of work we would be doing. We'd be going out and looking for models of who's doing this well, what can we learn from them? What does it mean for the state to adopt this as part of their assessment model? Some of the details, but clearly all to be discussed in the committee if this is an idea that resonates. The students would prepare and present their own interdisciplinary defenses of learning that would showcase their knowledge and skills through authentic demonstrations of work. The defenses would draw on best practices from the field in terms of ensuring both personalization and rigor, 2 values that we've heard come around multiple times. Schools across the state would use a common rubric to score the defenses, and they'd follow state established quality control protocols. And something that's come up a lot in our committee is thinking about interoperability, making sure that these defenses of learning or portfolios are traveling with students as they move from district to district for our students who are more mobile. And then students would also take the short form multiple choice assessment in reading and math. This would be a key requirement to make sure that we're complying with federal law here. Couple of legal considerations related to this. There's a provision under the Every Student Succeeds Act that allows states to pilot new kinds of assessment systems, such as the one that we are showing you here. So this would be legal. However, we'd need to pilot it first with a small number of early adopting schools, and then scale statewide within 7 years. And that's no small task. This is really complex to do. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of capacity building to do on the ground that you need local buy-in to do this well. So scaling within 7 years would be a significant challenge and something that we as members of the Cool Council would really have to think about very carefully to ensure whatever we're designing is sustainable and can be feasibly done within that time frame. So this is the first idea. We're saving plenty of time for discussion, but I just want to pause here to see if there's any clarifying questions. Is anybody confused about anything I've said, or did I go through too quickly through something here? There'll be time for discussion after I present the second idea, but I want to make sure that nobody's sitting there confused about something I've said so far. All right. Of course, there'll be time for clarifying questions if it comes to you at the end as well. So I'll move into the second idea. So the second idea, as I said, is focused on how might we localize accountability. So let's for a second leave assessment where it is, assume our assessment system stays the same, and instead think about, okay, what might it mean for us to sort of think about accountability and value local information into our state accountability system? Well, this slide here shows what our current accountability system is. We have 6 indicators at the high school level. Assessments in those 5 areas are the first 2 indicators: assessment of English learning progress, school climate and school safety, graduation, and post-secondary readiness. The graduation rate, as you all know, is sort of currently being debated in terms of from the State Board of Ed as to whether or not the graduation requirement will include that sort of defensive learning at the high school level around the portrait of a learner. And then the post-secondary readiness indicator, for those of you who aren't familiar, is really an indicator that offers a menu of options. Students can show that they're ready to meaningfully engage in their post-secondary plans in a number of different ways. Some of those are college entrance exams, or the AP, the IB, or the ASVAB for military. Also, a number of CTE credentials are recognized, as well as local internships and apprenticeship programs. For elementary and middle school, we just have 4 indicators, and they're the same as the first 4 indicators for the high school system. So if we were to think about valuing local indicators within the state system, we might think about it in this way. We might think about following along with what the State Board of Education is currently debating in terms of thinking about valuing those local defenses of learning in the graduation rate indicator, but then maybe also including those defenses of learning or local performance assessment as an additional indicator within that menu of options and the post-secondary indicator. For the elementary and middle school system, we might think about adding an indicator that's sort of analogous to that post-secondary readiness indicator, but rather than post-secondary, we're just called it readiness. We could call it whatever, but for the sake of this idea, we just put readiness there. And we could think about this as being sort of a menu of options of different ways for schools to think about how they're showing that they're preparing their students to be sort of engaged global citizens that are meeting the competencies as articulated in the state portrait of a learner or the local portrait of a learner through performance tasks, demonstrations of learning, exhibitions, maybe community engagements. And the work of our committee, should we move forward with this idea, would be to really think about, okay, what are the options that would make sense to go in there? What would make sure that we have technical quality and that we're holding our standards, holding all of our students to sort of high standards while also allowing for customization and personalization. Our work as a committee here would really be around operationalizing what does that menu indicator look like at the elementary and middle school level, so that it really incentivizes the spread of more vibrant learning experiences across the state. And this slide just sort of all goes through what I just talked through there with the slides. In terms of the legal considerations, this one, it's less clear cut that this is sort of fully legal, but I think it doesn't push the envelope too much, where I do think we would have a credible case to go to the feds and sort of advocate for this kind of indicator, right? So the there's two precedents that we'd sort of rely on for arguing for this kind of indicator within our state accountability system. The first would be that, well, the federal government already accepts the graduation rate indicator as comparable statewide, but we know that graduation is a local determination. Different districts have different graduation policies. Those are locally determined and locally played out. Individual students are determined ready to graduate or not by their district. That is not a state process. And so we sort of have that as precedent. The second precedent is that the post-secondary readiness indicator is a federally acceptable indicator. We have a menu of options, and on their face, those options do not produce comparable results for every student. That's sort of the point of the indicator. The ABSVAB is not comparable to a CTE credential, which is not comparable to the SAT. We sort of know that. And so there's legal precedent for establishing and accepting this kind of indicator within federally approved Title I accountability programs. And so while the legal pathway is less certain here, we do think that we would have a viable case if this was sort of an idea that we would pursue as a committee. So before I move into the discussion questions for this agenda item, are there any clarifying questions about the second idea, which is talking more about school accountability and school assessment than state assessment, excuse me?
Does the second one change where assessments are administered like the first one does?
No. So this second idea keeps the assessment system the same as it is currently.
So then does it just add the readiness but keeps everything else the same?
That's right. So we'd still have the state assessment in reading, math, and the state assessment in science, social studies, and writing, and all the same grade levels we currently have them. But we would be adding this readiness indicator, which would value the local work that many districts are already doing.
So Susan, I'll note here as well that this would require state statutory changes as well. So there's just some ideas on the table that would require discussion at the state and federal level. So, but they're just ideas for discussion at this point.
All right. So I'll just open this up to our larger discussion now. Thank you, Jennifer, for that. So given what we've discussed earlier already today about our moonshot, how do you see the ideas presented here around assessment and accountability, or both, resonating or conflicting with that moonshot? Are we getting closer to the moonshot by running with one or more of these ideas? Are we missing the mark? And I'll also just jump into the second question at the same time because it might help ground us. It's thinking back to those design principles. If we pull up that design principle document again, where do these ideas meet or fail to meet? What haven't we taken into account with bringing forth these ideas tonight? Also, just general reactions and ideas are welcome too. No need to feel constrained. I'll stop talking.
I don't mind to jump in, I guess, just to get the conversation started. So a couple initial reactions, I guess. Both of them in my mind don't feel like the moonshot, right? Like, but I mean, I know it's like, feels like, I guess, a step closer. The second model in particular, one of the things about that it reminds me of is that there was a time period where, I don't think they do it anymore, but it's probably now like the L3s or whatever, but the state used to have these districts of innovation. And my district was a district of innovation at the time. And that second model is basically like sort of what that was like, except it was more work. You were still doing the old model and held to that model, and we were expected to innovate and try innovative models. Now, it didn't really change our accountability score because there was not a score out there. I think most of the people really doing innovation don't care about the score, but communities care about the score. And I think they both also get to, I don't know, it feels like people are still going to try to game it and like, I don't know, compare. I think we're still going to have a lot of that. The first model isn't, so we don't actually test all of those at every grade now. So like 3rd grade only takes reading and math. 6th grade only takes reading and math. I mean, we test way too much, but we don't test all of the subjects so it would look a little different than the table. The grades that you talked about doing the gateways, or that were presented on the chart as gateways, or I'm calling them gateways because that's what our district calls them. But the presentations are of learning. Those actually are pretty heavily, well, 5th and 8th are heavy tested grades. So that would look very different for 5th and 8th grade. And 11th takes quite a few tests too, but like 3, I think. So I don't know. I don't know. It feels like honestly adding more than taking away from what we're already doing. But that's just my initial reaction. Maybe but it might be what's a realistic start. I'm not sure. I'll let other people share.
I think one of the pieces that I looked at when I was originally looking at that with the testing was that, yes, I know Suzanne's correct that we don't currently test all 5 subjects in 3rd grade. But sometimes I wonder if maybe we should, because then they would actually get science in 3rd grade instead of waiting until 4th grade to teach science. And they don't teach social studies in 4th grade because they're too worried about taking science because that's when it's assessed. And that maybe then, and I also think there's something to be thinking about, that just because we're assessing doesn't mean that we're doing the current assessment, that we could be thinking about, we're going to develop a local bank of systems for performance assessments for science, and that students are going to be utilizing those. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the current assessment that we have now, because I think at face value, yes, I see that. I'm like, we're just putting one more thing on teachers' plates to do and not taking anything off of it. But that it's not just a redesign of the accountability system, but it's a redesign of the assessment system too, in some aspects.
Thank you for calling out, Suzanne, that it's the wrong amount of testing there. Certainly it should be the right. And I apologize, that's incorrect. So it should be our current assessment system. And the idea would be, yes, in 5th and 8th grade or in other grades, to take away some of the standardized testing and insert in those defenses of learning. But yeah, I think you're right. It's loud and clear. It would be more work. It certainly would be, because right now the test is provided to you and the students just take it and you don't have to score it. You don't have to schedule time to schedule for the defenses or prepare students to engage in the defenses. Certainly both of the ideas on this table would present more work for local districts rather than less work.
And I guess for me, I don't know that it's an issue of, I mean, more work or easier, as long as there's a bigger trade-off, I guess. And I don't know right now if the trade-off feels like it's the right balance of what it is. Like it feels like, I don't know, Like, okay, for example, I don't know about, I'm only speaking for like the current system in my current district. That's my perspective, is, we have to spend a lot of time learning the system because it's online, and we had to buy a Gelastic because our kids can't navigate dragging things on a computer to make it work. So like that, we're spending time doing test prep at this point for a system that isn't really how kids learn and demonstrate their learning in real world, but it's a online test platform that, like, if we could let go of an online test platform, I'd rather have kids measuring real objects with real tools than, unless it's like a workforce readiness thing where at a certain age they need to be able to navigate a system that they would use in real life. I don't like, can we take that kind of thing off the table so our kids aren't spending time having to navigate and learn a digital platform to demonstrate their learning?
So I wonder if we really even agree on what the purpose of an assessment system is. And, as I look at it, assessment should really impact instruction and improve student outcomes. That should be the result of an assessment system. And I would pose the question, do either of those models that were presented do that? That's just something to think about, when we're looking at making changes like that.
And Jerry, I'm going to piggyback on this and ask you quickly, since you brought this up, I love it. What is the definition or the image that you have in mind when you think about assessment system? Right? Because that's something else that we're doing with throwing this system of systems, assessment system, accountability system around as if we all agree. So what does that mean to you, for example?
Well, when I look at an assessment system, I would hope that as educators, we use that to see if the instruction that we're providing students is actually getting the return that we're looking for. Is it impacting students in a positive way? And if not, we need to look within and say, then it's not the student that is the issue here, it's the instruction. And we need to change the way we're instructing students. So I think that needs to be one of the outcomes of this. But ultimately, and this gets back to the conversation at the very beginning of our call today about students, not being in that moonshot, does it have a positive impact on student outcomes?
Right. And Jerry, I just want to make sure I follow up on this. So that makes a lot of sense when I listen to you. Does the assessment system to you mean, for example, the collection of all the summative, interim, benchmark, and diagnostic assessment instruments, plus the professional development that teachers, for example, go through in order to make use of these assessments? Or are there other components that you maybe either would exclude or that would be part of that as you're thinking about
that? You've brought in an interesting piece to that, because if the result is that a teacher needs to change their instruction in order to meet the needs of students, then there needs to be professional development that goes along with that. So I think that, there are a lot of other factors on the perimeter, I think, that could impact this. But ultimately, if we're assessing for it just because we have to, which I think in many instances we do, and we're not using those results to improve student outcomes, we're simply looking at where students are, and we're not using the results of those assessments to make changes so that students have better outcomes, then we're wasting our time with assessment.
I think Jerry brings up an interesting point, because it goes back to the purpose, as he mentioned. Is the purpose of this assessment to be the end game? Are students ready to either progress, or are they meeting the standards with which we've set for them for that particular grade? Or is it to guide instruction throughout the year? So I think that's an interesting point.
I'll go back to what the point that Kathy has made so many times about literacy and measuring literacy. Are we measuring literacy just to measure it, or are we measuring it so that we can ensure that all students are literate? And that it comes back to the reason that we give assessments.
I think you're speaking to what we think about in terms of the theory of action around how do we intend something like an assessment or an accountability system to improve student learning or student outcomes. And provisioning actionable, meaningful data about where students are and how to improve is one possible way that assessments could improve student learning. Something that I don't know that our summative systems have ever really done well, right? Our summative systems are more sort of a status of very high level. Here's the sort of general proficiency level that your student falls on. It doesn't provide really much diagnostic information at all at the individual student level. Maybe at the program level, it could help there. I think the assumption around sort of these defenses of learning is sort of similar. I don't think that they're going to provide really actionable instructional information. I think the theory of action is more related to before the assessment experiences, right? In order for educators to work with students to prepare them to meaningfully engage in a high quality defensive learning, they're going to have to they'll have to impact their instruction and change their instruction prior to that, right? They'll be having to give students opportunities to really engage in meaningful, authentic work, to defend that learning, to critically examine their own learning and talk about it and metacognitively engage with it. And so it's not that, yes, this assessment is producing some kind of insight that we couldn't get from some other mechanism. But it's not producing actionable data, but instead, I think the theory of change here is more about we're sort of spreading vibrant learning experiences by requiring that students sort of meet this high bar of defending their learning. And we're thinking that's changing instruction beforehand. So I don't know if that helps.
But isn't what you just described assessment?
The defensive learning?
And all of those pieces that you just described.
Oh, sure. That's ongoing formative assessment. That's part of their teaching.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's where change takes place.
Mm-hmm.
What got me thinking about this as I was sitting here listening to the comments, what prompted me to even make that statement was, and I remember this fully when I was an elementary principal, and grade level would come to me and say, we're going to pull this subject out of what we teach because it's not tested at our grade level. And I said, no, we're not. We're not going to do that. So if the assessment is changing what we teach and the way we teach just simply because it's not tested at that particular grade level, that's wrong. That's not the reason that we assess. That's what got me thinking as we were talking here and caused me to share those thoughts. It's we have to get back to the reason that we are assessing students and what the value in that is and what the impact is going to have. And ultimately it should impact student achievement and improve student achievement. And if it doesn't, then we need to take a look. We need to go a different direction. That's my philosophical sermon for the day.
Yeah, and I think the traditional. I love your philosophical sermon too. I think the traditional tension that always comes up, right, is that the responsibilities of people at different levels of the system, at least under current constructions, are just different, and so they're always a little bit in tension, right? So like teachers and school leaders, and when you get then beyond that, and even like the school leadership to some degree and the district leadership, but at that local level, I think that feels more like many assessments, many different kinds of assessments can accomplish that purpose, and student learning is sort of feels like very directly affectable. Whereas if you go to the state level, and it's about like you're supporting initiatives at local levels to manage and support student improvement through structural efforts, right? And you also have to report to the feds. So then you need, at least traditionally, you need to have some kind of like notions of comparability and you know, some form, at least traditionally, of standardization. And so I think that's always the challenge, right? So that I think we always, and I think that's the challenge of a committee like this. We want to put on both hats, and we need to put them on and off at different times, right? So to sometimes say, like, if I'm in the state office, if I'm imagining I'm there, I have certain responsibilities, versus if I'm a teacher on the ground and a school leader on the ground, I have different kinds of responsibilities. And how does that play out?
I think this idea of teaching to the test is really one we should revisit and hang on to. I think it's a common criticism of you know, federal testing policy, and it's clearly something that surfaced in the United We Learn report, where the feeling is that the testing and accountability tail wags the instructional dog too much, right? But I think what we're trying to change here maybe is making the test reflect those sort of really powerful teaching and learning experiences that we hope to see, so that by Kathy, you're sort of imagining someone teaching to a defense. I don't know what you're imagining, but hopefully you're imagining somebody engaging in really powerful teaching and learning. And if that's not the case, then I think we've missed it. But I think that was the intention behind incorporating the defenses of learning into the state assessment system, or the idea. But I'll just preview what we're going to do for our next committee meeting. So in our next committee meeting, we're going to get back into our state-supported, state-centralized, and localized working groups, and continue playing around, discussing, iterating on these two ideas. Bring other ideas that come to you. Tell us we need to throw one of these out because it's terrible. You know, we're not attached to these particular ideas, but we do want to put something on the table that allows us to sort of throw darts at it, as Karen Dodd said, so that we have something concrete to talk about. So we'll keep talking about these. Are there any final comments that somebody's been waiting to say but not really sure when to jump in and say it? Now is your time. We have a few minutes left before we turn it over to Andre.
Susan, I typed mine in a few minutes ago. I guess for me, I'm just still feeling like a lot of what we're struggling with is, when it comes to the fear of change, is because of what our data looks like. And we have not come up with solutions for making our data look better. And I don't think kids are about data per se, but that's what people are concerned about. How do you bring about a change when you have not all, when it's not 100% positive? And so students are failing and performing at low literacy because they do not possess the literacy skills that they need. And so when we're talking about what you look like in 4th grade through 12th grade, if you have not, and I know you guys are tired of me with this, but if you have not got the basic skills, there is no way in the world I'm going to learn reading, science, math, or anything else. So, you know, when we're talking about this, because my thing is the readiness that starts kindergarten through 3rd grade, until we get to that point, then we will probably be less fearful about what it looks like to do assessments, because assessments, I just truly believe assessments are going to look better once we get the literacy skills to where they need to be. So that's I'm going off the mic now.
Thank you, Kathy. All right. And with that, and I'll turn it over to Andre, who will bring us back to our systems bank discussion. Thank you all for engaging. And thank you, Suzanne, for correcting my mistake there.
And Susan, actually, you said something at the end where you encourage people to think about, like, we're going to continue talking about this. And I think it came to me, one of the things that they might want to do is, I want to build a little bridge there, is this idea of this prototype idea of, or this example idea of saying performance-based assessments are sort of slotted in certain grades, right, for certain moments. There's a variety of ways in which that can happen, and everybody, I think the question is, do people first of all agree with that, right? So I think as you're sort of like reflecting on this, one thing that you might want to ask yourself is, if somebody said to me, performance-based demonstrations of learning, at least in certain grades, maybe like the ones that are put on the table, is a feature that a forward-looking system should have, for all the good reasons that Susan mentioned. If the answer to that in your head is yes, I think that's already really important, right? Because if that yes were to exist across the committees, then we can explore different solutions. And then to that, I think the question is, you might want to play out in your head, and maybe we'll come up with an exercise, we'll talk about that this week, where we could sort of say, what are different ways, right, in which this could happen, different mechanisms. And there's examples in Kentucky, in other states, where there's different ways of baking that into the system, so that it's not about whether even to do that, but just to play with that a little bit. And I thought that was I think there's a lot of good things that we could do, and we'd love to hear your ideas also from what's feasible on the ground, right, in terms of like lift and work and what has been done historically and what needs to happen in order to make this practically feasible. So wanted to mention that. Now I'm going to go back to my system, our systems bank. It's not my systems bank, but it's my task today to walk us through the systems bank thinking. So one thing that I would love for everyone to do is to go into the folder for the committee meeting today online, because I uploaded 2 documents into that. One is called a synthesis of the systems bank brainstorm, and then the other one is a template worksheet. And I would love for you all, especially our community members, because you haven't seen that yet, is to open up that document called the synthesis of the systems bank brainstorm. And so when I open that, let me see whether I can do that. Here should look like this. Can you see that on my end? So let's make sure that you can all access this. Is there anybody who has a problem with accessing this? It's actually technically, I should say, sitting in 2 folders. It's sitting in the August 7th folder, and then also in the folder for today's meeting. So you can just go on the one for today's meeting. I put it in both because we created the ideas last time and we're using it today. Anybody have an issue with that, or are we good? Okay. If you have an issue, put it in the chat. So what I've done here is so all the sort of all the incorrect language that may be floating around, you can blame me for that. But what I try to do is I try to take the ideas that you had put into this template where these questions were asked about what a systems bank might look like, and I pulled them all into this document, organized them a little bit into clusters where people were saying sort of the same kinds of things, maybe with slightly different words, and then create this document that you can all look at in one fell swoop. And so this table of contents that you see here is essentially the kind of issues that you were all discussing as you were thinking through your use cases. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you actually a few minutes, maybe about 5 or so, where you can actually go and read through this document in peace and quiet now. So just so that you can process that a little bit. You don't have to read like necessarily every word in fine detail, but just at least to like scan the headlines and scan the different sections. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the bigger themes, and then I have a little task for you. So why don't I give you 5 minutes, I said, for starters, and I'll check in with you. So let's, why don't you take some quiet reading time till 5:22 and just open this document up on your machine and read through that. I'll stop sharing. Okay, let's come back then. So for those people who are here from our community, are there any things that stuck out at you, that surprised you, or that were noteworthy? Anything, any reactions you want to share at a very high level? And then I'm going to ask you some more specific questions. Yeah, okay, that question was maybe a bit too broad, so we're going to be a little bit more specific in the next one. So I'm going to share with you 3 reactions that I had when I saw this. I think it's 3. The first one is, I appreciated all the different ideas that people put on the table. And to me, when I see these ideas, it was really interesting to see how many of you and many of our broader community here in our committee went relatively broad, relatively fast. So I was trying, you may remember that the activity was something like, think about a particular person in a particular role who's trying to fulfill a particular task with a particular goal, and like play that through. Well, most of you immediately went to sort of like broader types of role, lots of different people who have lots of different purposes. And so I think what that strikes out to me, that points out to me this idea that I think there is this notion of what a bank in terms of like a database is like, but it's also very natural for people to think about like these portals, essentially like resource portals that exist, whether that's on the web. We already have like a web space for KDE, you have local websites for your districts and schools. So I think this idea of that there's a web portal with a variety of information and resources in it, where behind the scenes a variety of databases are ideally connected to that hold different kinds of information. I think that's a very natural way for people to think about that. So what I like to do today is I had played with 2 different kinds of setups for this, and I think based on the conversation that we just had, I want to try with you one of the 2, the second one in fact. So if you go to that same folder and open the other sheet that is in there, that's called, let me go back. That is called the System Bank Local Feasibility Worksheet. If you could please open that up. So this is a worksheet that has 2 pages, and it has 2 different setups for 2 different kinds of tasks. And I wasn't quite sure how the conversation today is going to go, which one would be more appropriate. So I'm going to pick one of the 2. But just to tell you what the first one was, so in the first option, I was going to have you think through these different kinds of areas of information, and then think from a local perspective about like, what can be shared, when can it be shared, and how can it be shared, to essentially get at this idea of, if the state wanted to curate local resources and like level up or lift up the best work that's locally going on, similar to what's currently happening in the KDE database of best practices, where is that hard, where is that easy to do, and what could be lifted up. Now we're going to do option 2, which is sort of a twist on this. And given that we just talked about the defenses of learning, I'd like us to think, I was going to put you into smaller groups, but then I talked to individuals, and so that's not good. So I think we're going to stay in one big group today. There's like 2 sections to this. As you can see, there's questions about data, and I call that data in a database, and resources in a portal, because I see that as the 2 big themes that people have been talking about. People have either been saying like, I want to see data on, the graduation rate or learner progress or their pass rates or their different component competency performances on the defenses of learning, want to see that over time, et cetera, et cetera. Or they've been saying like, I want some resources. I want to see some best practices. I want to see some examples, which is often more the qualitative kind of piece to this. So I think we should talk about both of these today. We have about 15 minutes, so I think it's worthwhile starting there. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pick in your head, let's pick a particular marker grade for storage. And so let's say we're picking either 8th or 9th grade, somewhere around there. Let's pick 9th grade, in fact. And or do we pick 8th? Let's pick 8th grade. And what we're going to do is we're going to think about defenses of learning as an event that's happening in local schools, in a district, or in any kind of other educational institution for a moment. So I'd like you to think through these 3 data questions that are on this sheet, which is, think about the quantitative data that is being collected locally around these performances of learning, and then we're going to go to the qualitative piece after, and talk a little bit about what kind of data are those, what could be shared upward, sort of like in your local communities of practice or with the state. And where are there things that you're locally doing where you're like, I think we would be a little bit uncomfortable, or that couldn't be shared for other reasons. Would anybody like to start that conversation? So we have Jerry here, we have Ezodi. Who else do I have in my list? So I can't see you all. Erica.
Andre, would you repeat your question again, or your
Yeah.
statement about what you want us to do?
Yes. So imagine the scenario where we are in a transition grade. So let's say we're picking 8th grade, for example, and there's defenses of learning that are happening. So we just assume that that's something that a district has implemented at this point, right? So now think about those 3 data related questions. We're taking the option 1 on the second page of that worksheet. I want to say, so what kind of data are being collected around those defenses of learning, and what of these kinds of data would be easy to share up? What kind of these data would be very difficult to share up, or local districts would not want to share up? Like, in other words, if someone else wanted to have an insight into the work beyond the sort of like visiting the school or beyond the qualitative information that we're going to talk about in just a second, what is sort of an easy way to look at outcomes from that work? How about that? Does that help?
Thought.
Yes, Suzanne.
So when districts do the gateways or defenses of learning, they don't always so they'll often at different ages have a different number of, let's say, competencies that students are expected to reflect on or demonstrate, right? So it could be like at what number of competencies, and which do the students have choice? Are you making them like at this grade they can pick 3, or at this grade they're doing these 3? And then they should have some type of proficiency scale developed for the people reviewing those, and it could be their scores on those proficiency scales would be some quantitative data.
Mm-hmm.
And then
do you find all in your experience, for example, this is sort of where measurement hits sort of against the qualitative work, right? Like proficiency scale and abstraction. So you can have global scores, you can have scores for different sub-competencies, you can break that down. What has been your experience so far, either in implementing that or working with your colleagues?
So in my district, there's been a few different ways that's been done. And we're trying to improve that now. But in broad terms, I would say that the part of having a defense in our district historically has been that it's not just people who know you and people who are your teacher or even educators, are doing all the scoring. So there's people from the community, there's parents, there's different people involved. And so to do it well, you need to spend some time calibrating and educating the people who are doing the scoring.
Right, which then brings up the point, right, that if you want to understand not just like what is being done and somebody shares numbers with you and you take them at face value, there's this question about like, what do I need to know about the quality of the processes that are in place, right? And how much of that is like can be lifted up sort of and at what level. So for example, I'm going to do one more with you and then I know Azadeh wrote something and I have a question for her too. But so for example, what might you think is sort of a compact, the sort of like maybe shortest and sweet way of talking about or representing the quality of the sort of scoring process in this moment?
You mean
that you would think could be like, imagine as we've seen these databases where people talk about what is being done, there's performance of learning, you could have a link to, a scoring guide, or you could have a link to a one-pager that describes, for example, how the scoring is being done in terms of training. You could have data analyses that are being done on the data that you've collected at the district.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand what the question is you want me to answer though. Like, I think, you mean from my personal experience of what, okay, can you repeat? Sorry.
Yeah. I was trying to get at this point of like, if you were someone outside of your district and you wanted to understand what is being done at this level, and I'm going to the qualitative piece first, what would you be able to share up as a district in order to communicate that, right, without having to have a longer conversation? Is there a way to have this information living in a database, in a portal about those practices?
I think that there's a way to share, like, and I'm not saying necessarily my district we certainly don't have it figured out, but I think that each district could share their template of like, this is our plan for who's assessed and how at each of these points. These are the rubrics or proficiency scales that we're using, and this is our system for any kind of training for the students and because the students have to go through a lot of training too. The students, the teachers, anyone who's doing scoring, how we educate families about it. Ideally, you'd have exemplars of this is an example of students that were scoring at this level. And maybe without students' faces or whatever, this is an example of something that'd be scored at this level. But like, does that answer your question?
No, that's fabulous. I think that's exactly right? Because I think what I want us to get into, we all are like wrestling with is, right, that the Vibrant Learning Experiences Committee is, working with, PBL Works and Deeper Learning, and they're looking at various ways of sort of like lifting up and aggregating information. But at some point it's kind of saying like, yeah, like what's all the information that other people would need to see in order to really understand the quality of the work. And there has some practical, goals with that. Like you could then ask and say things like, well, how often are these things get updated? Is that the same for different districts? Is it, is it the same time? Do we do that once a year or more frequently? Is it, is it just locally sitting on a certain like well-maintained environment that you can just link to, or can that be imported? And that's in many ways, that's part of what people are wrestling with the KDE database too, right? Where it's like you have a certain entryway of getting into that system of best practices, but then I've already heard people say qualitatively, yeah, some of this is really up to date and others could use some updating, right? So there's this maintenance piece. So I just wanted to illustrate that. So thank you for saying that. So yeah, Azadeh, I saw that you put in there, we pull data in the chat. We pull data from our schools regarding classes taking earned credits. It's various like performance and movement pathway information. And then let me see what I said. In implementing PBIS, could you first of all say for me one more time what PBIS is, please?
Performance-based system.
Okay. So your future goal is to be able to pull reports monthly for behavior incidents compared to earned rewards. So when you think about this, the performance-based assessments, for example, in the context of the learners that you care about, how does that resonate? How does that connect, and what information in your practice then would you share up? This is very behavioral, I think, right? Like behaviors and incidents versus rewards. What would you share up? Is it just that, or are there other things, are the same kind of considerations Suzanne was just talking about relevant for you as well?
The pieces the community wants are, has there been a decrease in behavioral incidents? That's what the judge wants to know. That's what school wants to know. That's what the FAIR teams want to know. Has there been a decrease in incidents? So we're countering that with, not only has there been a decrease in incidents, there's been an increase in positive behavior. So one of the reasons we pull STAR reading and math as one of our benchmarks is that most of the time, and it doesn't matter for us, it can be 10-year-olds, it can be 21-year-olds, oftentimes their reading scores are significantly low. Sometimes so low they test not even in kindergarten.
Right.
So we're looking at improvements. Have our students been able to improve by going into a day treatment? Have our students been able to improve by going into a residential group home? These may be our 13 and 14-year-olds that have not received a felony, but are on someone's radar that they need out-of-home placement. And what we're trying to do is look across the state and across the board in our facilities that are not necessarily fully housing individuals going on to prison, but some of our alternatives to detention programs, other pieces. Are we seeing grade level improvements? Are students catching up to grade level? Because often they're 2 and 3 grades behind. So are they catching up? Are they getting to where when they transition back to the community, they could potentially sustain themselves back in a school environment?
Right.
But we're recognizing that we can't just send our STAR TABE test scores, because many of our kids have never learned how to take a test. Besides getting into the whole side piece of the testing industry and pieces and problems therein, we spent 14 months working on a dual credit program, only to find out of the 400 potential students, 1 student was actually eligible based on reading level.
Yeah, so that brings up it's a very different kind of like context and metrics and foregrounding of information and processes, right? And so I think this idea from having, like, if it's a committee, we want to work across committee boundaries and think about what the different sort of representations of the work are for different communities. I think to me, this highlights so clearly how we need to have the flexibility in our systems to accommodate with someone like you and the people that you work with to really share what's really important about that work, right? What indicators matter. And I see, Kathy, you put in there community parent engagement, was that inspired by what Azadee was saying? Do you want to connect that quickly? And then I'll wrap this up in a minute.
Well, I was just thinking the question was, what kind of data do we collect? And I think it's important for us to be able to have data that's readily available to our community partners and to our parents so that they can begin to understand what's going on in the system. And if community partners, if they're writing grants and trying to get resources for things to help the schools, they need to know what data we're collecting and how that data looks in terms of future applications for grants, for changing the workforce, for improving the workforce in some way. So that's how I was thinking about it. Yeah. And I said it because I know that parents are engaged in the Defenses for Learning in Jefferson County, and that opportunity to see how students are performing, and community members can come as well. And I think we need to see how engaged they are in our community, in our districts.
Cheryl, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, but I saw Cheryl come on. I don't know, Cheryl, did you want to say anything, or was it just you coming back on video? Did you have an idea?
I'm stepping back on, but I do think that Kathy brings up an interesting point, especially with the community services school grants that are out there for the next 5 years. I do think we have to take into consideration that there's lots of districts that are really pushing for this family engagement and how that plays into a student's overall success. We've been working with NYU with the Pritchard Committee over family engagement and how really transforming that into advocacy for parents, really digging into their funds of knowledge are just as great as the teachers when it comes to teaching their students. So I do think as we move progressively forward in partnering with parents, we do have to consider some of those data points as well, how we're engaging families, its correlation to student achievement, and then how we're tracking that.
Mm-hmm. And so since I have and I know I need to wrap this up in just a second, but I know there's some KDE people on this call, so I don't know whether anybody can speak to this or wants to speak to the idea of, are there any plans for redesigning, for example, the web space that KDE has, and where information about, let's say, just take this as an example, parental and community engagement is being helpful, how to sort of rethink that as part of this broader initiative and connect it to assessment information, or bring it into, let's say, an assessment space? Does anybody know anything about that? In other words, are there design degrees of freedom, so to speak, that our committee has? Because I think that's the idea, right? Like if there's something like the KDE database that we already have, and we can say that already exists as an initiative, there's momentum there, we could perhaps piggyback on this, right? So if there was an initiative somewhere for redesigning certain public facing representations around certain pieces that do affect assessment outcomes, we could sort of say, yeah, our committee can maybe provide some suggestions for different parts of this to you from the portal perspective, not just the database perspective. So that's why I'm asking that.
Andre, I think that there were other people in KDE that could speak more eloquently to that than those that are on the call today.
Yeah, I mean, for the website, there's always opportunity to change whatever's on the website, if that's what you're asking. Jennifer and I are not the two in charge of that, but right, that's not a heavy lift.
Yeah, and I'm asking this because, as I said earlier, and I'll wrap this up, but the whole portal setup that I think a lot of our members seem very naturally to wanting a lot of visibility into resources that are sort of, I think, currently managed in different places, in part by the co-ops, and as it should be, right? In part, we're not saying that the state has to hold everything, but this idea of where can resources live and where can the state help curate best practices and resources and make connections. I think if it's easy, right? If that, I don't take that for granted, right? It's rare that somebody says to me, website updating is something we can do relatively easily if we want to. Normally it's oof, that's a long process, 20 forms and budgets and all of that. But if it is somewhat a conversation that can be had, I think we in the committee we could frame our engagement along these two lines, and sort of like I could even see a world, and we'll discuss this on Friday when we meet internally, but I could see a world where we can, for example, have some people work, different people work on different aspects of these areas that people are interested in, look at different kind of information that's currently out there, and then have them make suggestions of maybe what might be really valuable to see lifted up at the state level. And especially, that doesn't mean that it has to be done in like 2 or 3 months, but it might be a good way for our members to sort of channel the thinking, and for you guys to all get to know, you know, like what it might be that is needed there. And in parallel, doing the database kind of perspective of saying, in terms of like quantitative data, what data can we collect, that, and what is sort of the quality information around the data that we can lift up. And that, to me, that brings up also the issue of like, what are the co-ops doing? You know, how are the different initiatives are managing that? And so that's something we in our committee need to also understand, I think, a bit better, at least from my personal perspective, so that we can integrate our thinking best with that. So thank you to those of you who were able to be here today and participate in this particular exercise. You'll probably get an email from me in case someone asks you, with a little follow-up task that's sort of along the lines of what we were starting to do here in 15 minutes, to just elicit a little bit of additional thinking around this sort of like feasibility and nature of the information at sort of the next grain size down, based on the synthesis that I've created based on all the things that you said. So thank you for that. And I'll give it back to, who do I give it back to? I don't even remember. Sarah, probably, right? Sarah.
It's Sarah, yes. So we've covered a lot today, y'all. Between visioning with Moonshot to looking at some possibilities for system prototypes with Susan, and then moving into that systems bank design with Andre. So now coming to our spot in the agenda for cross-committee collaboration outside of the items that are actually on our agenda and the work we've been discussing today. Is there anything in particular that you all would want to share out with the other committees? Because usually we're one of the first meetings of the month, I think. Because I was thinking a lot with our Moonshot visioning was the main thing for me. Kathy's usually our go-to person for cross-committee collaboration. So some of our brainstorming around Moonshot, and then particularly the bit with the systems prototypes and systems bank. Anything else? Well, I really appreciate you all. We've had some quality discussion today. Like, I feel like we've dug pretty deep into multiple facets of the work of this committee. General announcements today. Sorry, I'm brain fog at this point. Survey that the VLE committee sent out. Deadline for that is, I'm sorry, it's not VLE, it's the BNF committee, isn't it? Committee sent out is due on the 18th. So if you've not taken that survey yet, please do so. Please share it with at least 5 people in your network, whatever that may be, community member, parent, educator, etc. Please share that out. Our next meeting, let me get my calendar to cooperate with me, will be Monday, it's supposed to be October the 2nd, but we might want to reconsider that, because I just realized that's fall break in the state of Kentucky. So we will get back to you on that. We might have to discuss that in the planning committee on whether or not we're going to revise, because I just realized that it's fall break week and a lot of people will be on vacation. So we will be following up with some updates on our committee meeting date for next month. And then if you are interested in serving as the co-chair, I've had one person reach out to me with that for the next year when Kathy steps up to chair. Please let me know, because we will be talking about that at the November convening, and hopefully electing a co-chair at that point. So if that is something that interests you, Or if you know some other people on this committee that are not here today, please reach out to them if you think they may be interested. Jennifer, am I forgetting anything else?
No, those were all the good updates that we needed. Thank
Any good
you.
points? Okay.
And
All
just a
right.
reminder, the email that you sent out last Thursday as a reminder of the meeting today, there were some really good resources in it. The call to action specifically is in there. Other really good things that will be beneficial for your preparation as we move into October, and then especially the November convening of the Cole Council.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, if anybody have anything else they want to share, then I think we are going to adjourn for the day. Kathy points out she's really easy to work with. Kathy's fabulous to work with. She talks about literacy all the time, and I agree with every word she says. Oh, she's right all the time with that, and she's very passionate about it, and I really appreciate about that because she brings us back to what matters frequently. But she's great. She's super. You'll enjoy working with her and our little group that meets on Friday mornings. Jennifer and Susan and Andre, and now Laura has joined us as well. So it's a great weekly catch up. All right. Well, if nobody else has anything to share, y'all have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.